Welcome to Clocked In, the podcast where work works for people, not the other way around. We're Kristen and Ashley, and every week we dive into what's really going on in today's workplaces. From hybrid headaches to hiring trends, culture clashes to quiet quitting. Whether you're an HR pro, a people manager, or just someone trying to make sense of your 9 to 5, we've got the conversations that matter and the strategies to help you build a better workplace. So grab your coffee, clock in, and let's get to work. Welcome to this week's episode of Clocked In. This week, we're going to be talking about the latest spin on resilience, toxic positivity. We're your hosts. I'm Ashley.
And I'm Kristen. So, Ashley, the concept of resilience is certainly nothing new. I remember when I was working in training and development, I saw a really hyper focus on resilience during COVID, which made complete sense for the time that everybody was living in. But the amount of trainings and information that was being pushed out on this topic was kind of insane to me. But before we can jump into whether resilience can become a toxic trait in an organization, let's start by defining what resilience really is. So, what are your thoughts on resilience in general?
So, according to the American Psychological Association, resilience is defined as the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. Or, in layman's terms, it's being able to adapt and move on after hard times. So, when I think about resilience, I think of how common it is to hear about resilient organizations. These organizations can anticipate and prepare for all sorts of unexpected disruptions or changes that might come their way. They can adapt quickly. And businesses really love this idea of like thriving in the face of adversity. And we think about how many times people are talking about these unprecedented times that we live in. And that kind of catchphrase during COVID has certainly played out for years now. And so companies want these resilient employees who are able to adapt and adjust and move forward. But what people kind of sometimes don't say, but what they really mean is that they want people or employees that are continually embracing change. They need to keep adapting to an ever-changing workforce and what the realities of work are now. And so I think it's important to recognize that as good as resilience might can be, that there is an element of change fatigue where people just get tired of the constant change. And it's like, man, I want to be resilient, but things just keep happening. The rate of change is so fast, I can hardly catch my breath, so to speak. And so this is something that companies and managers have to watch out for as they're helping their employees navigate change and account for issues related to, yes, being resilient, but also recognizing there's a limit to how much people can actually adapt and change and stay resilient through. Have you seen this play out in the workforce, Kristen?
I have. So I definitely think that resilience was like a big buzzword during the time of COVID. And like I mentioned, I think it makes sense given that everybody, as a whole was going through a stressful time and a time of change, like you said, and it directly impacted how businesses had to operate. And almost overnight, everything shifted. And so it certainly made sense for the focus to be on resilience. But in my opinion, I think it became like the focus was so much on it, and it was like everybody is so stressed out with life in general. Nobody knew what was going on. I remember I had just had my first child at the time. I think he was only 3 months old, and so everybody was in an intense, constant state of stress. And then the term and trainings on resilience was just being thrown at you nonstop. And on one hand, I certainly think like in order to be successful in life or at work, you have to be resilient. You have to overcome changes. You have to be able to adapt. But just this constant pressure of no matter what comes at you, you just have to kind of get over it and you have to be resilient and work through it. That's where it can become kind of shaky to me, is if you just have an over focus on just being resilient for the sake of being resilient versus what are the true aspects of resiliency that can benefit you. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about if and how that can become a toxic trait or toxic positivity. But I think there's also a lot that can be learned from failure when you're talking about being resilient. So a lot of times I think we look at it as like things that are being done to us. We just have to get over it and deal with it, and that's being resilient. But there's a lot of things that can be learned in times of failure and in times of stress, and I think you shouldn't overlook that. And I think that's part of being resilient. But like you said, I think being resilient and dealing with times of challenge and change is not only going to impact individuals, but it's going to impact the workplace and organizations as well. But I think where we could really start to see some problems with this idea of resiliency is when we're looking at Gen Z entering the workforce. So, the first article we're going to look at today is from the Society of Human Resource Management, or SHRM, and it's entitled Generation Z, the Loneliest, Least Resilient Demographic Alive. And really, this article outlines why they believe Gen Z is the least resilient generation, which essentially comes down to the number of mental health issues that this generation is experiencing. But I think it's really important because it calls out what the impact of these mental health issues and that they can have, what they can have in the workplace. So it can lead to things like higher absenteeism, less confidence at work, lower work performance, higher turnover, and then less overall satisfaction with the work that they're doing. So, Ashley, I know we've done some research together actually on Gen Z. So, what are your thoughts on this article?
Yeah, Gen Z is really taking over the workforce. We're seeing them in our college classrooms and then entering the workforce as well. And so I think there are two kind of key takeaways for me from this article. One is just the focus on mental health awareness. That's definitely common among this younger generation. And I'm seeing it with the Gen Zers that I interact with. They're more open about mental health than previous generations. They're more likely to seek help, to talk about anxiety or depression, and to reject the idea that struggling in silence is strength. And so for some people, like that kind of vulnerability and like that kind of visibility into their struggles can be seen as being fragile or weak, but it can actually be reframed as healthy vulnerability if it's done correctly. And so this is something that organizations and managers need to consider, that this younger generation is different in that they're okay talking about mental health, and that there need to be kind of guidelines and appropriate conversations around what does that look like in the workforce and how can you support your workers. And then the second key takeaway for me was like this redefining of what resilience looks like. So older generations were more likely to see just toughing it out as being resilient, right? But Gen Z may have a totally different perspective on what does resilience mean. And it might be things like setting better boundaries, saying no to burnout, no to toxic jobs or toxic relationships. And so while some people may see these as like acts of weaknesses, they can actually be signs of emotional intelligence as well. And so when we think about what does it mean to be resilient, I think that word and kind of that idea is changing, and you're seeing a different form of strength or resilience, even though Gen Z gets blamed a lot of times with things like, oh, they're the least resilient generation. But maybe their definition of resilient is just a mismatch with older generations. What are your thoughts, Kristen?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, I know that we have done a lot of research on Gen Z and kind of what they're looking for in the workplace specifically. And then obviously both working in higher education, we interact a lot with this generation. So I wasn't necessarily surprised by what this article had to say about them. And I think I've already started to see some of those behaviors in like a classroom setting. And so that's one thing I always concentrate on. It's how can, even if you feel one way, like how do you behave appropriately and professionally in the workplace? Because I could definitely already see some of these traits that are coming. And so, but of course, I had to go to my new favorite site, Reddit, to figure out what people were saying. And there was a whole post about this actually, about how people in this generation lack emotional resilience. And a lot of the comments were centered around the mental health issues that they had. But it was really, some of the users were calling out how it was almost like too much of a hyper focus on the mental health of why, and that is what was causing this lack of resilience, because they were all just focused on internally their own feelings and self-care versus dealing with the problem and being able to move on from it. So almost like getting too stuck in your own emotions to be able to work past it. And while I think there's so many benefits that come along with focusing on mental health and having a better balance, and that can really be a strength of that generation, of being able to say, like, this is how I'm feeling and I need to take care of myself in this moment. Maybe something that other generations, millennials included, have not always been the best about. But I think the danger of it comes when they're just sitting too long and focusing too long on those emotions, because then it just gets caught up and maybe exemplified sometimes if you're just focusing only on something negative versus, okay, this is a negative problem. Maybe you need to walk away for a little bit, but now how do I come back and deal with it? And something that was interesting of the comments that kept coming up was they kept saying that the technology and how Gen Z interacts with people is directly impacting their resilience, because a lot of them live in a virtual world, so to speak. They're not having as many face-to-face interactions with people. I've been seeing more and more articles about how Gen Z specifically is using things like Chat GPT for friends and to get advice and things like that. But one user on the Reddit thread called out that it's leading to a lack of resilience in their opinion, because instead of dealing with conflict, so if you and I are having a conflict face to face, I have to deal with it. I guess I could walk away, but that would be really awkward, and you could follow me and different things like that, or if you're in a workplace setting, you can't just escape conflict. But if you're only talking to someone online or through social media, you can just block that person and you never have to deal with the conflict. You never have to get over that problem. And so I thought it was really interesting that they called out how the overuse of technology and that being their main form of relationships is perhaps impacting how resilient this generation is, because they're not being forced to deal with problems. They can just click and then it's done, and they can block someone or be, done with them. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's easy for people on the outside to kind of want to point fingers at Gen Z. And I love actually talking to Gen Z and seeing what's their perspective, what are they kind of like, what's motivating what they're doing, and kind of the way that they see things. So, not just talking about them, but inviting them into the conversation. And I think there's a lot that we can learn as they are in the workforce and starting those careers from both an education standpoint, but also for managers. And I think that when it comes down to like this Reddit thread talking about this generation, one comment that I saw a couple of times was about grit and how they just don't have grit like the older generations do. But to me, grit is different than emotional resilience. So, grit is more about sustained perseverance. Like you're continuing on towards that long-term goal, even though you might have obstacles or failures along the way. Emotional resilience, on the other hand, is that ability to adapt and recover from emotional setbacks or the stress. It involves like self-awareness and emotional regulation. And so, like, emotional intelligence is something we talk a lot about with our students. And how do you be true to who you are and recognize what you're feeling, but not let that derail you or come across as unprofessional? And like, what does that look like in the workplace? And so I think it's important that we separate grit from emotional resilience because they can work together, but they're not the same thing. So grit will keep you moving forward towards goals, but that emotional resilience is going to kind of help keep you stable when things go wrong along the way. And something I think that can really help anybody with this is having a growth mindset. So seeing those setbacks not as the end all be all that are just horrible, but like it's a growth opportunity. What can you learn from that? Now, some lessons are hard to learn, but sometimes you can take some really key takeaways from even bad experiences in the workplace. And so, kind of keeping that aim on moving forward with that emotional resilience can be a strong benefit in your career development.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you brought up the concept of emotional intelligence. So I'll save my thoughts on that, but I think that concept is so closely tied to resilience and what we're going to talk about. But now, so for the big question, when does resilience become toxic positivity? So, what do you know about toxic positivity? What have you heard about it?
Right, so resilience is a great attribute to have, but it can go too far. And that's what we're going to talk about today with the toxic positivity. And so the idea of toxic positivity is like good vibes only. Like it overrides, being positive overrides all other emotions. And then it actually in turn shames people for being human and having other real feelings about something. And so, yes, we want to be stable. We want to have that emotional intelligence, which I guess we'll have to do a podcast episode all about that. But like, it can help us individually, regardless of whether it's Gen Z or any other generation. But it can go too far into toxic positivity where you're just invalidating everything else. And it's only about being positive, being upbeat, looking on the bright side. And so it's comments like, oh, if you lost your job and someone says, well, everything happens for a reason,
Mhm.
or you're feeling burned out and you're venting to somebody about it, well, just be grateful you even have a job. Oh, you're feeling overwhelmed at work? Well, don't worry, just think positive thoughts. And it's like, okay, these comments might be well intended, but they really shut down emotional expression and they discourage people from being vulnerable with one another, which is already hard enough for people to be in this day and age, especially with the social media things you were talking about earlier. But this toxic positivity is harmful because it invalidates those emotions. It suggests that having negative, like in air quotes, negative feelings are bad or wrong, or that you should only be positive, you should only be optimistic. And it just keeps those emotions suppressed. So people start hiding their pain instead of processing it, instead of talking about it, instead of sharing it with a friend so that the load might feel a little lighter. Now they're just having to bottle it up because who wants to be met with, oh, we'll just look on the bright side, or things will get better, or you might feel shame because now you feel weak or guilty that you're not happy all the time about everything in life. And it really shuts down communication. So if people feel like they're not going to be heard, they stop talking. And this is true whether it's a friend or a family member or a relationship, significant other, a workplace relationship. We want to feel like we can be honest and like we can share information without just getting shut down by it.
Yeah, I think you make some really great points. And actually, our second article of why toxic positivity is holding you back and what to do instead, it highlights so many of the things that you mentioned as well. So, really, the whole idea and how they define toxic positivity is the idea that no matter how difficult or painful the situation is, you should only focus on positive emotions. And so they give examples very similar to ones that you gave. So just look on the bright side or just stay positive. And it's where anytime you encounter anything negative, it's just trying to flip to be like, well, at least this didn't happen. And so I definitely have a lot of thoughts about this toxic positivity idea. The first is I should probably be ashamed to admit that the first time I heard about this was when I was listening to, of course, another podcast, and they were covering the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni case. I don't know, did you follow that at all?
I did not follow it
Okay, well,
quickly.
you saved like hours of your life by not getting, entrenched in that drama. But I covered it pretty closely, too closely, there for a while. But then I think like Blake Lively, it's part of her lawsuit, said that Justin Baldoni was like toxic positivity. And I had never heard of this term. And I think I often wonder, like, because she said it, is that now why we're starting to see more and more articles that are coming out about it? And on one hand, I completely agree with everything that you said of if, especially if you're as a manager, or even as a friend, if I were to come to you and be like, oh, I'm having a really bad day, like my kids are sick, my house is a mess, and students are listening to me at work, I'm gonna have to fail a student on this grade, I'm having a conflict with my coworker. And if your response is always, well, you know, at least such and such didn't happen. Like I'm going to stop coming to you for help or problems because I know that the answer is just going to be, well, at least this didn't happen, or you should be glad that you even have a job. I've heard that said sometimes, if you're complaining about your work, well, at least you have a job. And to be honest, like I find myself sometimes saying this, but I think really going back to something that you said earlier, this idea of toxic positivity. It's it's not so much being like I don't think that people intend to just have this overly positive attitude, and that the majority of people probably don't intend to dismiss people's feelings. I think instead it goes back to a lack of emotional intelligence, and specifically the lack of empathy, which is a component of emotional intelligence. And I remember I was doing a training on emotional intelligence in the workplace. And that's when I really started to dive into the concept of empathy. And one sign of being a non-empathetic person was saying comments like this to people. And it kind of gave the difference of sympathy is like someone's in a hole and you're like looking down and you're like, oh, I'm sorry that you're in the hole. Good luck, sort of thing. Like, I feel bad for you. But then empathy is putting yourself into the hole with somebody and saying, like, how can we get out of this together? So to me, where I have kind of a problem of this concept of toxic positivity is the extreme version of the word toxic. And I think so many things come along with using that word. And from an HR perspective, I was kind of cringing as I was reading this because I just kept thinking like, oh, please don't start training your employees on not having toxic positivity in the workplace, because then employees are going to start reading into every little thing like, oh, I hope that you have a great day. Oh, well, you're now being, too overly positive towards me. When I think to me, at least the people that I've encountered like this, there it goes back to the intentions. I don't think that they're intending to be dismissive. And now, certainly, you have those managers who are just being dismissive. But to me, then it's not focusing on the toxic positivity aspect. It's how can you grow an emotional intelligence so you can respond to people in the right way. And so, from a business perspective, that is when I was thinking about this because I remember, I don't know, have you ever heard of the term like microaggressions?
Hmm.
Yeah, so that was kind of around the same time of when all the resilience push was coming out. All of these like little trainings started coming out about microaggressions. And my boss at the time was like, oh, maybe we should train our workforce on microaggressions. And essentially, microaggressions are just reading into every little behavior that people are doing in a sense and making sure that you're not being subtly aggressive or passively aggressive to people. And I remember asking her, my boss at the time, do we have a problem with this? Like, are people being passive aggressive or, subtly aggressive with one another in their tone or how they're like positioning themselves towards people? And she was like, no. And I was like, well, then I don't think we should train people on it because then it's just going to have them focused on microaggressions and reading into every little behavior, if that makes sense. And so it's kind of like whatever you focus on, that's what people are going to pay attention to. And so, from an HR and business perspective, that's kind of my concern with this new trend of toxic positivity is that it could become like an employee relations issue waiting to happen. But at the same time, I think the value that it calls out is training our leaders and employees to be emotionally intelligent and to have empathy for one another. Because if you have managers who are constantly just dismissing employee emotions and concerns, that is definitely a huge, huge problem that you could face.
Absolutely. And I think there's a tension here, right? Like sometimes we all need some motivation or some tough love to kind of get us out of just wallowing in self-pity. But at the same time, like who wants to be met with toxic positivity when they're trying to share something that they're going through, or a difficult time, or something they're experiencing? And so we have to be emotionally intelligent to kind of handle both of those. Like there is that tension at play. And one thing that I really liked from this article was how they were talking about genuine positivity. So this is a mindset that balances optimism with realism. So you're not just dismissing any kind of less than positive emotions, but you're focusing on acknowledging emotions. So, what actually are you feeling? And what is knowing that like resilience can start with self-awareness, right? So what am I going through? What am I experiencing? And then really looking at what can you control? Right? So building that sense of agency. What can you be in charge of? What can you change about yourself or your mindset or your situation? And kind of reducing that helpless feeling that sometimes comes with difficult situations. And then reframing those struggles as opportunities for growth. So that growth mindset that we talked about earlier. What challenges can be, or what lessons can be learned from these challenges, and just recognizing that it's okay to be, you can be resilient without being toxically positive all the time. It doesn't have to go to toxic positivity is the only way to be emotionally resilient. And so actually it's better to really hone in on what you're feeling and why and what you can do about it, and being realistic and kind of that like optimism that things will get better. Maybe you'll make a change, maybe the situation will resolve, but like being more genuinely positive, not just toxic positivity where the only valid emotion is to be happy all the time, because who that's nobody's life, right? Like that's not reality.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, again, like you called out a lot of the key aspects that our last article, also from SHRM, of identifying and preventing toxic positivity in the workplace, kind of all of those behaviors that leaders can be on the lookout for to see if this trait is popping up. And again, like I think it would be more a lack of emotional intelligence and empathy, but are they, like you said, are they using the dismissive language, such as just look on the bright side, or it could be better? Or if it seems like everybody is just like forced cheerfulness, so not like the genuine positivity that you were talking about, of like, I really do just want to work through this and help you through this problem, but it's more like I have to act like I'm in a good mood or happy about everything, because being negative is not an option, because sometimes things are just bad, and if you don't know about it, then how are you going to fix it? And then I think also like the last one that they call out, like the emotional shutdowns, from employees when they just stop voicing their concerns or they just seem very disconnected. That can be a real problem, because at the end, then that starts to impact how resilient your workforce is going to be. If people aren't voicing their concerns, if they're not even attempting to work through them, they're just shutting down, and then that's the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the leaders really set the tone for what is the workplace culture going to be like. And toxic positivity can be a subtle but really serious threat to a healthy workplace culture. And so leaders play that central role in either reinforcing toxic positivity or working to dismantle it. And so they have an opportunity to balance motivation and realism and empathy that can really help employees manage the challenges that they're facing without going too far into toxic positivity. So we
Yeah.
want to know, what do you think about this term? Have you heard it? Have you seen it in the workplace? Let us know. Leave a comment below.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and share this episode with your friends. And that's it for now. We are clocking out. See you next time.